My name is Ben Croker. I'm here with Delaney Gillilan, and we're going to talk about Datastar. We've been working round the clock for months, and almost 2 weeks ago, Delaney, we released V1 Beta 1, and that feels like a lifetime ago,
Yeah, that was really
going
two
by
weeks
the rate
ago.
of development.
Feel, yeah, it feels like a couple of years ago at this point. Really, 2 weeks? It's been 2 weeks?
Yeah,
Oh, that's
which is
crazy.
amazing. And I mean, the great thing is, we said when we reach V1, it's still beta, right? But when we said we release V1 stable, that's it. The API is not changing. So, like, tell me, is it done? Are we done? Can we finally say we're done?
Yeah, I think so. It's been quite a journey, especially since I first kind of put out the feelers to people to say, hey, Datastar's been done for me for a long time, but I feel like with the right eyes and the right people involved, we can make it way better for everybody else because it became something that worked for me and we wanted to be something that worked for everybody. The irony is we're a lot closer to the original design of Datastar, but how to make that happen? Yeah, that's been a hell of a journey.
So my journey was actually via HTMX. So I was involved in HTMX in the early days, right at the beginning, and was contributing as well actively. And then I built Sprig, which is a craft CMS package on top of that. And the issue that I ran into is I was reaching these like limitations or points of friction, and a lot of those I was able to smooth over using Sprig, but it got to the point where I kind of hit a wall, and I realized I can't get past this because I'm physically restricted by the underlying library. And I've been following your work because you were quite vocal in HTMX as well. And I think we shared a lot of opinions. And then you went off in this other direction. And I didn't really pay too much attention until, um, I was like, okay, well, maybe this does bypass a lot of the issues that I'm running into. And that's when I contacted you and we started having conversations. And in the beginning, I was like, I don't know how open this guy is to changes because I was suggesting a lot of changes.
Yes,
But
you
little by
were.
little, we actually made the API better and better. And I would say we rewrote it twice. You rewrote it twice. Like I've been doing a lot of docs and like API stuff and design around the ergonomics of using Datastar. You've been doing the rewrites, but I would say like V1 is kind of like internally a V3 because we wrote it twice. So
Yeah, that's
what's your
very
story?
accurate.
Like, why were you not done? Like, why did you even pay attention to me back then?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because the thing is, for my needs, the irony is that there's a lot of features that people wanted out of Datastar, and they wanted a lot of things that, to me, is almost recreating a spa because it's very easy to go all the way and try to add more and more stuff inside of the framework. So part of me was fighting back against that, but also part of me was like, these are some really solid ideas here because it's going from what works for me to what works for an entire framework. I've been there since before, well before React, like back in the Move Tool days, and like seeing even the progression of Vue, where it used to be a very simple uh, thing and it turned into an entire ecosystem. I didn't want that, but at the same time there are still some really good ideas there. So it was more that like I am open to ideas, but you have to want to prove it to me and you have to really care because it's very easy to have an opinion in this stuff. It's very different to stick around and fight for your opinion. And that's the thing that it was interesting that because the irony is the thing that you wanted in the first place, which is multi fragments inside of a uh, response, you're even now saying, hey, that's probably a bad idea, but you should support it anyway. The irony is that the thing that brought you to us originally, you don't even use now. So it's, it's kind of
Well,
funny.
that is interesting. Yeah, it's not that I don't use it. It's just that I had all these. I recognized like these inconsistencies in the API originally, and I was like, okay, you called it one thing here, but you gave it a different name over here, and this one is singular, this one is plural. So I think what brought me in was like those kind of small things. I thought, how could we just smooth out the API? And what we ended up doing, you and I together, was saying, okay, if we could from the ground up like design the perfect API for our use cases, and we have actually very different backgrounds. We should say that you have like a Go background with Nats, and you're doing a lot of lower level stuff, and I primarily work with PHP and a bit of a higher level stuff where I'm working with content heavy web apps and websites. But we kind of brought those together and we said, if we could design the perfect API, what would that look like? And that meant introducing breaking changes, which is always kind of something that we tried to prevent. But it was at version, when I got involved, I think v0.18. So we were at pre-release. That's the time to break things. That's what you kept saying. If we're going to break something, let's do it now. So we progressively, initially, I think we were going a bit slower, thinking about how to make incremental improvements. And then we kind of said, okay, let's really rethink everything, essentially. And it's not that the underlying code changed that much, but we just did big refactors to put that API in place.
Yeah, and the irony is that we actually went from, before was my first attempt at just, hey, what do I need to do to get, because really Datastar attributes are just strings mapping to strings. That's all they are. And it's like, okay, how do I turn that and make it into these reactive expressive functions to make signals declarative? Because I love signals. I think they're great. I think what SJS and Solid and all these people in the space did is really amazing, but it's really hard to get right. When you're writing the code, it's very easy to mess up signals. So making that declarative was really the thing that I really cared about. Everything else is a plugin, but that part I felt was a mandatory step. But the irony is that before I basically said, hey, I'm going to just get something working. And then V2, when you got involved, was basically, hey, can we get rid of all of this magic and just make it happen under the hood? Can we just make it so that you don't even know that using reactive expressions? Can you just go about your day? And we went down that path and went down it hard. And that meant a full rewrite because everything turns into regular expressions. One of the issues you have is you don't have a parser and lexer in your own little language because that's just a huge bloat. You're basically adding a language on top of JavaScript, and you don't want to do that. So you're really limited in how you parse things without writing a parser. So we went down that road, and everyone, was like, okay, well, we'll make these changes just to, if this is what you have to do to make things happen. And all of a sudden had an epiphany one day of like, hey, I can actually make this work doing more crazy regular expression stuff. And we went from crazy regular expression version 2 to crazy expression version 3, which looked exactly like the very first version of Datastar was $signs for signals and @ for actions. And that was it. So the irony is that all this work happened around us not knowing how to do it well. So it's really my fault that this wasn't what version 1 looked like in the first place. It could have, the API now is much better. It's much more consistent. It has more features, and yet ironically, it's smaller. Because when you came on, I think it was around 15 or 16 kilobytes, and we're down to 12 now. So
yeah,
it's kind of crazy that we have way more features now, way more consistency, and it's 25% smaller. And it's still already the smallest framework by far. By far.
That's crazy to me. I mean, some people will think of that as a vanity metric, and sometimes it is in the JavaScript world. But the fact that we're adding features, the fact that we're doing refactors, and the code base is getting, like the gzipped compressed code base is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, is pretty crazy to me. And it's not like we don't want to bloat the code, but to me, it's like a testament to the simplicity of the architecture and how well it's designed and how everything is a plugin. So and we should mention this, the core. Oh yeah, I want to talk about library versus framework, but at the core, Datastar is a tiny library of about 4 to 5 kilobytes compressed, and that's kind of the core engine that takes care of signals and reactivity. And then basically every other feature that's included in Datastar is a plugin. So we have this plugin architecture. So of course it's extendable. You can add your own, but generally speaking, when you download the Datastar bundle, you get all of those plugins included. You added something very cool, which is a bundler. So you can actually selectively, remove things, and it will build a custom bundle for you, which I don't know if anyone's going to use that, but it's pretty cool to have. So you can say, okay, we don't need this feature, so let's take that out. And it's not just that it reduces the file size, it also limits the surface area of what you're able to use. And that might be desirable if you're working in a team and together you decide, we don't want to use this feature because whatever reason.
Yeah, I wanted to basically show that, first of all, we're doing all this without node modules. So everything is vendored in, everything is built from the ground up. We don't even use npm or anything like that. So we actually build it using Go. Use Byte under the hood is using ES Build. So being a Go guy, I said, hey, why not just use ES Build itself? And it works great. So it's actually embedded in our website. Is a TypeScript compiler. It's just built in. So the irony is that when I first built it, I was like, well, it has to be bigger than HTMX and Alpine and parts of React and all these other things. I knew that it basically in my head, I was like, well, it has to be bigger because I'm supporting all the things that everyone else is doing. I'm just making it in a plugin way. I did not expect at all that it would be A, the smallest of any of the libraries, but B, with everything, be still smaller. So I really cared about being able to be selective. And I guess the other thing too is that the biggest flex for me is that when you go to the bundler and you click on a plugin, you open it up and you can see all the source is right there. Like it's there. Nothing's hidden from you with Datastar. There's no magic involved. It's just doing the stuff that you'd have to do by hand and getting it consistent. One of the things that I love about Go is that it's a very simple language, but everyone's code basically looks the same because everything's formatted the same, everything's built the same way. So it's very easy to get your head wrapped around. I don't want Datastar to be this giant framework or this big ecosystem. I think it enables you to completely bypass that, especially if you're a backend dev. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about how small it's gotten and yet how many features it has.
And just to give a bit of more context there, like in the general sense, Datastar takes the best of HTMX and the best of Alpine JS or something like that, brings them together in one cohesive solution. And yet Datastar with all plugins is smaller than both HTMX and Alpine JS without any of their extensions or plugins. So that's pretty crazy to me.
Yeah, in fact, it's 25% smaller than HTMX now. And the real irony is that our biggest source of size is Idiomorph, which is built by Carson Gross, and he didn't want it to go into HTMX as the default just because he felt like it was too big of a leap. And I said, no, it's a great idea. Like it goes in, like that should be the default. What he's doing there is a great idea. I think there's some ideas where you can make it even better, but in general, it's the best version of it. So we include it. So
Right.
yeah, a large chunk of our stuff is actually Carson's code. So if you're an HTMX fan, it's like HTMX 3.0, which by the sound of it isn't ever going to happen. So
no, HTMX is done, according to Carson. So in terms of dependencies, we're very selective and careful, right? So there's Idiomorph, which is what we're using, Preact signals. And you talked about signals already. For anyone who's not familiar with signals and how that provides reactivity, go check out the Getting Started guide and Datastar, because we have interactive examples and we kind of walk you through. But essentially, Datastar makes the use of signals in Datastar expressions declarative. And that means it's kind of, you don't need to really understand them. It would be helpful to, and I suggest that you read a little bit of the docs before you get into any deep stuff. But the other big part, of course, is we call Datastar the Hypermedia framework, right? So we're saying framework as opposed to library, and we discussed this, you and I, internally, like, do we call it a library? Do we call it a framework? I think there's a sour taste in many people's mouths from the word framework because it's just been overused in the JavaScript world. But what we said is, well, look, the core engine is the library. The core engine plus all of the plugins, that's the framework. And it gives you pretty much everything you need to do Hypermedia with front-end reactivity. So can you like kind of expand on Hypermedia? I know a lot of people have asked me, what is Hypermedia, or what do you mean by Hypermedia?
So one of the things in the hypermedia space that was really hard for me, in fact, I talked about this in my original Utah JS Conf talk, was I didn't understand hypermedia at all. When I thought of REST, when I heard the term REST, it was just meant JSON over HTTP. Like that's what it meant to me because that's what it seemed to mean everywhere. I was like, okay, cool. This is how I get my data. Great. I get it and I go about building my front end. But really, the core term is the worst acronym ever, but it really does explain it, is HADIOS. And that is hypermedia as the as the state. Oh man, I can't even remember it now. It is Hypermedia
Hypermedia.
as the engine of application state. So the whole idea is that basically what you're doing is, instead of dumping down your entire app to the front end, you're only rendering what you can see at that moment. And a canonical example is if you have a bank account or a bank website, you don't want the person on the other end to have any knowledge of what's going on to show them that page, right? If you show someone a login page and then they put in some credentials and they come back and you show, here's my accounts, you don't want that state to be driven down or to show them an entire ledger of everything that's happening or what they're allowed to see at that time or what their credit score, all that kind of stuff. You want to show them the rendered view. And then part of that rendered view is a set of links or a set of ways to interact with it so that you can then get the next piece of state. So it's basically putting all the logic in the back end that's possible, but there's still going to be some logic in the front end, as in, for example, when you're inputting a field or doing that, interacting with something directly, right? So there's still some state in the front end, but very, very little compared to like the way people normally make apps. And I didn't understand that for the longest time. I really thought that it just meant JSON. And the true irony of words is that the way that people use REST nowadays doesn't match actual REST at all. Like, it doesn't match the idea of representative state transfer. What they're doing is they're transferring data, not state, and then they're recreating the state on the front end. So I had a hard time with this. I'm like a low level guy. I don't think of myself as a front end dev at all. And so once I got my head around that, it really did seem like, man, Hypermedia really is the best way to do it. But the problem is that HTMX itself is a library. Like, it is a library in the deepest sense of, it is not a complete solution. It is part of it can get you the fragments that you need to update your page. Awesome. But when it comes to front end state, you have to either do that with raw or JS, or you have to add something like Alpine or Hyper script. There's all these things that you have to do to basically, it's not a complete solution. And the part that I found is that, for example, getting the Datastar attributes and pulling them out and getting all the right information out of them, like, is there a key? What does the thing inside of it expression look like? What are the values? Like, there's a bunch of bookkeeping that needs to happen, and then there's the declarative signals part. Everything else is a plugin. A lot of times people talk about Datastar, the real time. Like, if you want to do real time, then use it. Otherwise, use HTMX. But all the real time stuff is literally just a plugin. You could throw that away. Like, that's not Datastar in my mind. The library, you can completely replace it. In fact, originally it was a direct clone of the API of HTMX, and I don't know if I even committed that. It might be in the repo somewhere at the very beginning, but I think I didn't even do it because I said, this doesn't match what I want to do. I know I can do better and make it easier. So to me, that's where the line is that there are certain things that you have to have at a library level to make Datastar valuable at all. And everything else is an option. I just think that our built-in options basically cover every single thing that you possibly could need, especially with the new API, with the execute script and all these things. And the fact that you can update signals directly, like we have a protocol in place now, all the things to make it like a legitimate, those are decisions at a framework level, not at a library level. You don't have to do any of that stuff to use Datastar as a concept. But as soon as you say, we're using the SSE, we're doing this stuff the way that they intended, I think that's a framework. The thing I agree that frameworks, there's a new JavaScript framework every week, right? It's a meme, or it's every day. But to me, if you can make an entire framework that is smaller than any of the other libraries, man, that's powerful. I think that there's a value there. So I don't want us to discount the fact that we are a framework that happens to also expose our library. In fact, in the bundler, I was talking to Ben yesterday, and I kind of want to turn the all plugins and the none plugins to say library and framework, or vice versa, right? So that you want the framework, click the all plugins. If you want none of that and you just want the library, hit none and you're good to go. So that to me is the line. And I agree that it's been misused, but at the same time, so has REST, so has Hypermedia, so has these concepts of what the browser can do. So if we're gonna like fight the fight and take back the word REST and Hypermedia, we might as well fight the fight and take back the word framework for JavaScript.
Right. Yeah, my thoughts on Hypermedia first approach. have to do with the backend driving the state, right? So the backend is where your state is persistent, right? That's your source of truth. You have a database or file system or whatever. And your front end state is ephemeral. So the backend tells the front end what the user can do at this very moment. The front end has some reactivity using the signals, and that can be sent back up to the back end. But the back end is driving the state of the front end. And that for me is the big unlearning, because I think I said to you many times along this journey, like, this has not been a journey of learning for me. This has been a journey of unlearning, because I have all these like bad habits that have just become natural. I think, oh, that's the way to do it, right? Like like a classic example and a trap that I've fallen into many times is like I have, I don't know, let's say an entry or something on the front end, and I have an edit button that I want to be able to quickly toggle between read mode and edit mode. And my initial intuition says, oh, just, I have signals, I have front end reactivity, just switch it from, a paragraph to a text area field or something like that. And the problem there is that I'm dictating on the front end what the user can do next, rather than the back end dictating, because something may have changed in the meantime. That entry may have become expired, or someone may have disabled it, or they may have even updated it, and I'm not going to see that in the meantime. So while it's possibly counterintuitive to go to the back end, what you're doing is you're kind of checking in with the source of truth, and you're updating things on the front end in a way that means that your state does not get out of sync, or it reduces the chances, at least, of getting out of sync. The other thing that I think we stick to very much as possible is semantics and the HTML spec. So we're not entirely spec compliant, but whenever we can, we reference the spec, and we try to stick to it as much as possible. Would you agree or have anything to add to that?
Yeah, before we go, I will circle back. But before that,
Yeah.
what part are we not compliant on? That's the part I'm interested in. I actually don't know of any place. Like, we've made some concessions just to make sure we are spec compliant. So I'm actually curious which areas we're not.
That is a good point. I don't have an answer. Yeah. So
okay. I mean, there's things that I've been very. If I wanted to play the games of like what Alpine and HTMX do, where basically just make whatever attributes and make things kind of that technically work but aren't technically correct, my life would have been a lot easier, and we'd actually have some easier features. But I really wanted it to be that you could put this in any HTML parser or validator, and it would work 100% of the time. So if we aren't, we will strive to. That's the only thing that I could see when people are like, "Hey, is there anything changing in V1?" And my answer is, unless you can find a spec compliant reason, no. Like, unless we're missing something, it's not changing, because it doesn't need to change. Like, it's in a solid place. I will say that and this is kind of where the line is for us in my mind, is that Datastar is a library. You can literally rewrite HTMX in Datastar 100%. I know it because I already did it. But we disagree with some of those choices. Like, for example, hxget, right? hxget under the hood is basically doing a on-click and then doing a get call and sending something off. Now, that is technically a few bytes shorter than the Datastar version, but my thing is it's not as composable. So now you have to learn hxget and like all these different examples of it. You're like, well, what if I want to do it on a click down? Now you're setting up hxget. The irony is it actually gets longer when you stop doing the basic version. Like, in real life, it tends to get longer.
It's like hxget sounds short, but it turns into hxget along with a bunch of other tags like hxselect, hxtrigger, hxtarget. And then it's this thing that just grows and is you carry on.
Well, it stays consistent, at least in Datastar. Like, it is composable and it's consistent. So if you learn one way of doing it, you now have that same interface for everything else. I originally was a 3D artist before I ever got into code. And one of the things that I love about tools like Nuke or Blender is that you could be in a 3D scene and hit B to select a bounding box. And in the 3D scene, it looks and feels that way. And then you can go to basically a file system setup and hit B and do a bounding select. And even though you're in a completely different context, you have the same mental model of, I'm selecting a bounded section of these things. And it doesn't matter if you're selecting files or if you're selecting a 3D scene or you're selecting colors, it all works consistently the same way. So for me, it's about the composability is way more important in the semantics. But again, if you disagree with us and you want to do HTMX, you literally could do it today. Like it would be very easy for us to make that over, but that's where the framework versus library line is. If you want to make HTMX but make it smaller, I guarantee it'll be smaller than HTMX, which is the irony. Even though you're basically writing it on top of what Datastar already does, it would be smaller, and I think it would be easier. But that's where we just disagree about things. And that's fine. The point is that if you have a better option, great. We would love to use it. But I do think that composability and simplicity are what make Datastar really solid. Is that I will not compromise when it comes to, look, if there's a better answer, like for example, SSE. SSE is just a plugin that people really tend to misunderstand because it can do the exact same thing as any other REST call or any other fragment call or any other thing, but you can send multiple chunks. So why would you have multiple ways of doing it when that way is a superset of everything you could do with a standard fetch? So HTMX, for example, sends a fetch and you get back a response.
Well, I think we'll come back to SSE in a moment. I just want to wrap this one up. So Datastar is HTML spec compliant because it uses data attributes. My bad. I guess I think of it that we're extending the HTMX.
The HTML. No, I know Carson has invaded all of our brains with HTML extended. Like it's very smart. He's very smart.
Yeah. It was a good move. So we've extended like what you get out of the box with HTML, but we've done it in a declarative way, embracing hypertext.
Yeah.
And
when I first started working on this, I thought like I thought web components were dumb, and B, I thought the data dash attributes thing was a dumb call. I thought data star attributes were dumb because it's like I already have all my state in my front end in JavaScript. I don't need any of this. I already can just pull down the JSON. Like this is really dumb. But as soon as you say this is a way to declaratively assign custom values, now all of a sudden it opens up the world. We are the most spec compliant. Now, technically HTMX and Alpine both can actually put stuff in their attributes. But my thing is that I feel like they have to do a worse job just by definition of how they work, is that you have to put way more tags and way more things that have nothing to do with your actual rendering. So for example, HX target is saying, HX, which is it target, the one that's the URL one? I'm starting to lose my HTMX thing. Like the one that you're basically saying what URL to use, right? Like, so if you're doing HX get and then you have to do HX trigger on which element to update and all this stuff, right? Like you have to put those in your tags.
The element is in target,
Yeah, so target. So the thing is that my opinion is that you are putting in your attributes how to do the thing instead of what to do, which is, to me, very anti-hypermedia. The whole point of hypermedia is to, like, your tag should be like what is rendered on the screen and what's the things that can affect the screen right now, not what could happen in the future. It's like it's basically saying, like, giving instructions instead of saying here's the results. So I actually think that the Datastar way is much more correct when it comes to actually implementing hypermedia as intended.
One of the questions that has come up a lot, and I think will come up a lot, because you touched on web components already, is like, I have this need, I have this client that has this crazy date picker thing, and it has all these custom needs. How do I do that with Datastar while embracing hypermedia?
Yeah, so this is another area where I thought this spec was dumb and everyone was dumb, and it was me that was dumb, is that web components don't make sense in my mind if you are already doing SPA development, because you already have your state in the front end and you don't care about sharing your thing with a Vue app or Svelte app or anything like that. It doesn't make sense. Whereas if you embrace web components and you have a unified way of building logic, then it's not about sharing it between SPA frameworks. It's about sharing it between backend frameworks. Now all of a sudden it's a superpower because I can create a component that I can build in Go and do all my crazy things. And I can hand it to Ben and say, hey, use this in PHP. Here's how you drive it. So what happens is Datastar, you use it to update the props and hook into the events of your web component. Now you can use it literally anywhere with any backend, with any logic. That to me is amazing. I do think that people want to go to web components too early. Like, I built a 3D engine and I use a couple web components. That makes sense. Some charting libraries make sense, but a lot of times people go to it way early. I actually unless you're doing the person we were talking about originally that was using Datastar and making a date picker with a web component. I agree with why he's doing it because he's actually dealing with legacy things where he has to integrate with people that are using like Ember and Vue and all that. And then it's like, okay, well, now I have to share this logic between these people. But even that date picker, if you're doing that purely in Datastar, you just do it in your backend. Like most of the logic is in your backend anyway, and you're just rendering SVGs and like a Flexbox thing. I don't know if I would even make that a web component. Maybe I would, depending on the styling and all that stuff. But like, I think people go to web components too early. But just like the same thing, Datastar, I actually don't think you should use signals very often. I think people try to go to the signals way too early. And most of the time, your code should look like a smaller, svelter version of what HTMX is doing. Because HTMX, in the general sense, is 90% correct. It's that last 10% that you spend 90% of your time on, right? Like that's the issue. It's not that Carson was wrong. It's that it doesn't go far enough.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the areas that, for me, it was the case for me, but other people will experience that too. That they're stuck in their old patterns. They have to unlearn things. A lot of people receive the reaction, you're probably overcomplicating things, because they come into Datastar and they're trying to do their SPA things, but just use Datastar instead. So we hear that a lot in the Discord. But what I love about the Discord, and for anyone who's not involved, come join the community. It's a very welcoming place, and I think we talk straight to people. Like it's kind of a no bullshit.
It's welcoming, but we're not going to do your homework for you. That's kind of the
and it's
vibe.
Not purely vibes based, and that's another thing I value. It's like actually driven by data and metrics and facts. And like if you prove someone wrong, or I speak for myself, I'll admit my mistake, and I think that's what kind of drives us to make improvements. So any advice for someone coming to Datastar with this kind of crazy needs, or they're trying to port their app? Like, is that even a good use case?
I think that the irony is I think Datastar is actually really good in brownfields. And the reason why is because it's so small and it can encapsulate. The only thing that it's hard, but this is hard with literally any app. For example, if you're doing a React or an Ember app, it wants to control your entire loop and everything that you're doing. If you can make a little section that's like, this is off limits, this is a DMZ for outside content, then it can be really easy to integrate with another app. It's just fighting the VDOM, but that's literally any app that you do. So if you can give yourself an iframe or just an area that you basically tell React, hey, like, don't try to do anything with this VDOM. I don't know what the current state of the React ability to basically turn it off for a section. I think there's some tools in there nowadays to do that. I know there is for Vue, but I think it's amazing in those situations because you can start to slowly simplify your stack and you can slowly simplify what's going on because more and more goes on in the back end, which means less can go wrong in the front end. So there's a lot of value there. I will say that people think that I just say overcomplicated and don't tell people how or why they're overcomplicating it. And part of that, I think that unfortunately for a lot of people, it has to be a journey. If I just tell you the answer, you're not going to embrace what's going on. You have to see that like, hey, this seems because the problem is people have a cargo cult kind of normality to what their code looks like. They think that, man, this whole section is really easy compared to what I did last year when I redid my framework again, my JS framework. I rewrite and it gets a little bit easier for me to understand. When you just delete all that code, people think that I must be missing something. Like I must be giving up a feature if my code is so much smaller and stuff. Like I do real-time 3D applications with microseconds and all that. And my code, it looks simpler than any CRUD that I see on a normal database. My code is simpler than theirs. And the key that I found is that writing simple code is fast. You can't, most of the time, beat like O1 and login and all that. It depends on what the O is, right? Like, and if you can make your code a lot smaller, man, ends can get pretty big before you have an issue.
Right. So in my experience, using Datastar for a greenfield project is a no-brainer because it's like it gives you everything you need. And in terms of brownfield, I find that what ends up happening is that, I just end up deleting a bunch of JavaScript. It's fantastic. And if you think about it, if Datastar in total is 12 kilobytes compressed and you're loading in 30 kilobytes of JavaScript, maybe you're doing something wrong, or maybe you're relying too heavily on JavaScript
Well, there was even someone like yesterday, I think last night, came in and said, "Hey, can't we just basically do the same thing in React? Why like basically can we just do this in another JavaScript framework?" And my answer was, "Yeah." Ironically, I've been involved with something where someone took Datastar and they wrapped it in a React component because they're more comfortable as a React, and like they're just adding layers that don't need to be there, but they feel more comfortable with it. So technically, you can 100% do that. And you're still getting a lot of the value of Datastar, but you just have to really think, why am I doing this? Most likely it's a cultural or it's a managerial thing and a social thing, not a technical thing. And that's one thing I will say about the community is that we are not, uh, we're less interested in just being popular and being the correct solution. So a lot of times you'll see something and you'll feel like, hey, they're not really listening to me. It's because like, no, we are listening to you. We just know that you're not on, like, you're not there. And prove us wrong. Like, in fact, today someone was talking about like, hey, I want to do offline first for something, which Datastar, the framework, is very against because we're very much hypermedia focused. But Datastar, the library, 100% can do offline first and do that kind of thing. And the reason why he was talking about it is doing it to basically offline communities that aren't don't have the resources and they want to basically do educational stuff and have that be an offline first situation where most of the content is available. When they do have access to a connection, it's dumping down data and then doing stuff in the local storage with service workers and stuff like that. Datastar would be amazing in that situation, the library, but you would have to build a framework specifically made for offline content. And it's funny because he first came and we said, "What are you doing? Why are you complicating yourself?" And then when he said, "Hey, I'm actually trying to write something that for people, doing education where security isn't much of a concern. I just wanted to get content to people." Great. That means that we need to help him work on a framework for that. And Datastar can support both, but most people should not be doing that. If security is the number one, like if you're working in anything that actually affects people where the code matters, security matters and being up to date with the right state of the thing. A lot of times people will talk about optimistic UIs, and I think they get that wrong of what that means because they basically, in the React world, it's the equivalent of saying, "I'm going to lie to you about I made the change and then go make the change," because the change has to get turned into JSON, it has to do all these things, and then it has to send back a big response, right? Like you're sending back a big chunk, you're sending up a big chunk of data and you're sending down a big chunk of data. Datastar's approach to the general solution is you send your post or your put or whatever you're working on, and you can start updating the UI immediately as things are happening. And in case you need to roll back, like then you can send another update saying, "Hey, actually that change didn't happen." So like you can actually make updates to the UI directly in a SQL transaction, for example. No other framework I know pulls that off as just like that's the default. You can just start updating the rows and updating progress immediately, like within microseconds. You can start sending back a response. No one else does that, and I feel like that's more the default than the offline first and all that. I think that's a great solution, but at the same time, that's what not most people are dealing with.
Yeah. And I would summarize it as if you're considering Datastar and you're open to doing a hypermedia first approach, then absolutely come and you're welcome. But if you're not interested in a hypermedia approach, if you want to do essentially an SPA disguised as an MPA, probably not for you. Or,
yeah, but hypermedia in general isn't
options
for you, so you shouldn't use any of the hypermedia approaches. Like,
exactly,
you're not going to have a good time. But I will say that I will take on anyone that any of the problem is we don't, I'm not an influencer kind of person, but the thing is, any of the influencers, anyone that says, "Hey, I have an app that's better in React or whatever," I'll take on any takers when it says I can make a hypermedia one that's more performant, and all that stuff. So I've already done that a couple times, and the code's smaller and it's easier and it's very fast and performant and it's more secure. All those are things I care about.
All right, let's talk about SSE for a bit because I know that seems to be a sticking point for people. I don't really understand why. It's probably just missing some understanding. But SSE, I might try to explain it if that's okay, because I know that you spend almost every second day you're explaining SSE to various people. But so Datastar is just sending GET requests. Like it's sending fetch requests, and they can be get, post, put, patch, etc. And what comes back is an SSE formatted response. So all you're sending back is plain text. You set a content type header to text event stream. But otherwise, that's pretty much all you have to do on your back end. There's no special infrastructure involved, nothing like the complications with WebSockets, none of that. And then you're just sending down plain text, and your plain text is simply wrapped in, it's prefixed with some tags that tells Datastar, hey, this is the type of event we're talking about, and here's the content. Now, what you were alluding to is that you can send more than one event. Actually, Datastar allows 0 or more events, 0 to n, and n can be as long as you want. So you can keep that connection open. You can have a long-lived connection, which probably makes more sense in languages like Go than in PHP. But what that means is that you can send responses as things happen on the back end. So a live dashboard, for example, you no longer need to do polling every second or every 5 seconds. You can have those server sent events because it's unidirectional, right? So those events can only be sent from the server down to the client, but that connection is kept open persistently for as long as you want until that is actually closed from either end. So that's one of the big differences. And even though I work with PHP, so we generally don't have long-lived connections, we have a short connection. PHP spins up, it shuts down, sends the response, and you're done. I still see the value in it because in something like HTMX, you can only send down a single fragment down the wire, right? Now, HTMX has things like out-of-band swaps, which allows you to send multiple, but that was kind of an afterthought. It doesn't feel like a first-party thing, and the API is kind of clunky around it. In Datastar, you can send literally as many events as you want. So you can update as many fragments on the page as you want. You can update signals, you can merge signals in, you can remove signals. And what I generally do in PHP is I will use a short-lived connection, but I might update a couple of signals, I might update a couple of fragments, all in that response. Now, it's what's still interesting about it, even though it's a short-lived response, is that maybe one of those pieces of logic that I need to do, I have to go to the database and I have to do a couple of writes. So maybe that like has a delay of half a second or something. I can still stream back the things that are fast first. I can still update the page because those are streamed. It's not like you have to wait for the entire response to be rendered before you can start sending things back. You can start sending things back straight away asynchronously. The browser will update the DOM and then you close the connection whenever you're done. Did I miss anything? Is there anything that's people need to know about SSE?
No, the one thing that I will say about the general thing, I really do believe in the value in what Carson has done with HTMX was around getting the ideas out there of like what basically eschewing the kind of the route that we've been going. And that comes down to, I agree with his ideas, I just disagreed with his implementation. And part of that was, hey, people are taught to don't repeat themselves and to break things up into separate pieces in MVC and all this stuff and basically separate your concerns. And one of the things I think Carson was trying to popularize is the idea of locality of behavior. It's kind of like, it's also like, for example, the Vue composition API, where you're basically keeping all your stuff together, whether it's components or logic or styling, it's all kind of together. I feel like locality behavior is much easier to work with than separating out every concern. And I thought about it at a deeper level of, okay, SSE is a superset of what you can do because you can start sending down your response immediately and then finish your response or not finish it. Like you can go on forever, right? So it's already a superset of what you can do. You can open and close it. It's the exact same cost as any other fetch request. But it allows you to basically say, hey, I'm going to start sending down chunks immediate and flush. It'd be like the same as a progressive image. It doesn't mean that you have to send down less of the image. It's just saying I can start sending down parts of the image immediately, right? Mm-hmm. And most of the time, I think most people will just start sending stuff down and send it back. But the kind of the key thing for me is that it changes your logic. So even though you're opening it up where you can have a million different things in place, for most people in most responses, just having the response exactly where you created the logic, like if you're pulling something from a database, the next line being, okay, render that component. And the ideas that he had around locality of behavior, if you take it and make everything OOB and make that the default instead of the opposite, and you also make it so that, look, if I include a ID in my fragment, it already knows where on the page to update, right? So if the ID is the default and that morphing is your default, now all of a sudden you're not putting HX triggers and HX targets and all these, like all that stuff just goes away because you're already implying that with your actual semantics that you built in. So your code gets smaller and you get responses immediately and things are in the right place and it's smaller and it's cleaner. That to me is the true version of locality of behavior, and HTMX cannot support that. And they have extensions for SSE where the problem is SSE by default built into the browser only supports get. But if you want to do post and put and patch and put things into your content, like it doesn't do those things. So we have a version that handles that. But the backend doesn't know or care because all it cares is I got a request and I'm going to send down chunks of the response. The fact that you can do that immediately is just such a easier way of working. So even though people think of it as this, oh, it's a real-time thing, I only can use it for real time. No, just put your logic right where you need to put it. And that's it. You're done. Like that to me is the power that they really need to understand of SSE. It's not that it's real time. It's as real time as you want it to be. It's you can send down as much data as you want, and that can be nothing, or it could be gigabytes of data. It's up to you.
I remember in the early days hearing you say that like there are lots of SSE libraries out there, but you probably don't need one. Like it's 4 lines of code. So I was like, okay, I need to go test that theory. So I went and I wrote a little PHP package that kind of just wraps it. So you just say, send down this fragment for me. And it just, wraps that fragment in the Datastar SSE event. And that's it. And we built on top of that entire concept, and now we have SDKs for various different backends or languages. So just to point them out, we have a Go SDK, PHP, Python, Node, .NET, Java, and some more are coming. So we have like different people because the community is quite multidisciplinary, I would say. So we have like people from all ends. The thing that we have in common is that we're comfortable working on the back end, right? Or at least we're not pure front end people. So different people have contributed different SDKs. And what the SDK allows you to do is simply kind of just have a backend API for your language or your framework. So you just don't have to do that syntax or that formatting that's handled for you. And then on top of that, we have some people have taken it even further. So actually today I released the Laravel package, which integrates with Datastar. I have one for Craft CMS as well. So those are PHP. And we have community contributions as well. So I know that we have something for Django, we have something for Quart, Fast API, a few different Python frameworks. And I'm sure there are more. And there are more coming all the time. So and it's interesting to see how little code is involved there. Like I would say that the SDKs for the languages handle like most of the logic and the wrapping, and then the framework specific stuff is just a little bit of sugar on top of that, just to keep things feeling consistent with the framework that you're using, and provide the documentation and some examples, and that's about it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was really excited about, especially when you came on, is that SSE itself, people way overcomplicate how hard SSE is. Like it's literally a prefix of some text and some new lines. That's it. That's literally all it is. But Datastar, the SSE plugin, does have basically 6 functions that you have to implement to be a SSE backend. So we could get into those another time. But the point is that you have 6 functions that you have to be able to implement, or 6 different versions. And once you get those in place, now you can do everything that any Datastar backend can do. And then it's up to the backend authors to say, hey, I want to add a little sugar. Hey, I want to make it so that prefetching URLs is kind of built into my sugar and stuff like that. Like, but it can support everything you need to do in 6 functions, and they're very easy to write. So the value is that we now have an agreed upon thing. And what my hope is that when people are answering questions, we'll be looking at the actual responses of your Datastar SSE responses. We don't care what backend you're on, but we're all going to be speaking the same language, and we'll all have the same tools to talk back and forth with each other. So the value to me is not so much in the code, but it's we're trying to agree to the standards so that we're all on the same page when it comes to actually talking about it. So for me, it's more of a social it's a social contract more so than just a technical one, because the code itself is so tiny, but it's a social contract that we all are agreeing on what things look like.
Right. For me, it's been interesting to be working both on the front end side of things and the back end side of things. So I know that you primarily do like 99% of the front end TypeScript work, but I've been making small contributions and doing things here and there. But it's such a different approach to working on the back end, right? Like on the back end, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll just add another error and a detailed explanation. And but as soon as you're working like on this tiny, beautifully architected front end framework written in TypeScript, it's like every character kind of counts. And a perfect example of that is something we've been working on for the upcoming beta version, which is error handling. And I just want to talk about this briefly just because it's so present for both of us. So we catch something like between 40 and 50 errors that can possibly happen in Datastar. And that doesn't mean that it's very error prone, but we try to put you on the right path. So if you do something that you're not supposed to do, because we all know this, that the default error messages in JavaScript are terrible. They don't tell you anything, right? So we try to preempt those. We catch those errors before they actually are thrown, and then we throw our own error telling you exactly what happened. But to do so, you can't really minify that. You would have to output that error message, every error message in plain text. So what we do is we give every error message a kind of a code, human readable code, and then we give you a URL. And when you click that URL, you go to the Datastar website. And at that point, we've sent not only the error that took place, but all of the context around that. And then we're able to give very detailed instructions, examples, even suggestions. Maybe you were trying to do this based on the signals that were valid at that point in time. So I think that has been a hugely interesting thing for me to see that. And it's a perfect example, right? Where you just put what you need in the front end and no more. You send the context, and that's what kind of we do with signals in the library itself or in the framework. You send the state up to the back end. The back end parses that and figures out, what does that actually mean, and sends the response and the state of the world to the user at that point. So I think that's a really interesting piece that we're working on, and it sets us up for success, because once all of those error messages and that context is being sent to the back end, then we can just build on that. And I see the errors as being part of the documentation, right? We're and we're doing this also for future you and I and anyone else in the Discord who's answering questions, because if people get a useful error message with suggestions, they can very likely help themselves, and they don't need to go digging through issues or asking people.
Yeah, I can't take too much credit for it, even though you're like, hey, that's a really good idea that you were thinking. It's not really my idea. I even though I do quite a bit of, I guess, what people would consider low level stuff, I really do not like Rust at all. It just does not vibe with. It's like the anti-Delaney setup. But one thing that's absolutely amazing about it is the borrow checker gives some amazing error reports. Like, it guides you. It's not just hey, here's in the stack where things fell apart. It's here's what's going on. Here's why. Here's probably what you need to do. Go look at these docs. Like, it's really, really smart. And it has to be, because the borrow checker is a rough beast. But it's a great idea. So one thing that I tend to do is I really don't care where the tool comes from. If it's a good idea, I like to pull it in. I like the ideas more than the tools themselves. And this is a situation where we're just literally trying to do what the Rust borrow checker does. But again, like you said, we can't do that in a tiny library. There's just not enough room. So if you send it off to the backend, you can do all the processing in the world. And it also helps us in the long run, because if we put things in place like analytics to say, hey, people mostly hit this error, people are hitting this version of it. Here's how deep their nested signals get when they do hit this error. All those kinds of things. Like, we have a power that we can help people out. And you just wouldn't get that from any other framework that I know of. It's not that they couldn't. It's just that, can you imagine if React, you had to basically embed the like all the different versions of the help functions just for like a debug mode? How big that would be? You're talking megabytes to like dozens of hundreds of megabytes of data that you're sending down by JSON or embedded directly to get that feedback. I don't even know what that would look like. You would probably have to do it in Nest or Next or whatever, and then have it sent down. It just seems like a nightmare. Whereas this is just us doing some if checks in the backend and doing some regular expressions on the contents of it. Like, it's not hard, and that's the value, is trying to simplify things and try to. The fast code is the code you don't write. So that's what we're trying to do. In fact, if it was up to me, we would probably get rid of even the names in the front end so that they could just be codes, because it would make us smaller. And yeah, once you start doing stuff in Datastar, especially if you're trying to contribute to the front end framework, it's so small that everything feels so heavy. Like a name of, hey, this is a bad idea, that's just too long. You're like, bad idea. Like, everything
Right.
gets smaller because everything's so clean and small. You can feel the cost of a single string. So
Right.
it's kind of
And we tried that. You have to admit, we tried like errors 1A, 2B,
yeah, we did.
7D, and as the person who's writing most of the docs, I just couldn't. I wasn't okay with that. I was like,
I
no,
know.
we need to provide a human readable error. So we have something like invalid expression, right? It's a bit
No,
longer.
it's
But
fine. It's fine. It's fine. No, it is funny because I've never been one of those people that really cared about how small like a library was, to some degree, because a lot of stuff I do is offline, or I'm doing giant charts or real time things, and that is just the non-issue. Like, you're downloading an entire 3D engine, you're looking at a megabyte of JavaScript anyway if you're pulling in 3GS or something. So like, normally that's not an issue to me, but I will say that for first paint and for most apps, man, it is a night and day difference compared to most applications, because even you pay a one-time cost and now it's in your cache, and because there's so little of it, it compiles. And also, it's you're only running stuff as the plugins get loaded in. Like, if you use a plugin, then it gets loaded. It's crazy fast to work with. I don't know of any faster framework. I haven't done a ton of tests against the other spots, but I can guarantee that we can get into the like millions of DOM nodes a second, updating without even blinking. So it's pretty crazy.
well, for two people who just met like less than 6 months ago, I think we've done some amazing work, and I think we're a
Has
good
it been
team
less than
too.
3 though? It's probably been less than 3.
It was October, yeah, well, not much more than 3. But yeah, and I think we're a good team, like,
Oh
because
yeah,
you care deeply about the integrity of the library and the code base and sticking to the spec, whereas I'm like, I care a lot about the ergonomics and the presentation and the documentation and how we're explaining things, and the error messages, for example. So I think like having two people who care very much about those two somewhat, in some ways, opposing interests, we've managed to bring those together, and from here on. So just to circle back, we're saying V1 is kind of Datastar's done. We can add features, but we're not going to introduce breaking changes. We may end up eating our words. We'll see at some point in the future. But what's exciting to me is that there's so much that we can build on to the back end now, because we have this context that we're receiving. We have the error messages that we can, and we shortly soon will be tracking. We have a bunch of documentation, examples, SDKs, frameworks, all of this stuff.
Even things like, for example, the offline version, we've set up the bundler in a way that basically I took the same ideas. I'm a bit of a keyboard fanatic, and there's ZMK and QMK have these really interesting ideas around these folders being tied to people's namespaces so that they can have their own layouts and things going on, but everyone can get access to those things. So we're set up in a way where we have the official bundler and plugins, but we can make it so that there's an entire offline framework library. In fact, if HTMX wanted to port their stuff over, we can make it so that that could be a bundler option. So you could literally have HTMX built in with the Datastar plugins. So we're set up in so many ways for people to think we're wrong. Like, that's fine. Like, right now, that's the irony. Datastar is the hypermedia framework in my mind, but you could rewrite HTMX. You could have an offline. You could have it be the way that you do spec compliant frameworks going forward. We just happen to come with the hypermedia framework out of the box. I'm pretty excited because if I'm wrong, I want to be wrong and use other people's tools and get back to making code and not writing JavaScript. Uh, the irony of like hating JavaScript is you end up writing a lot of JavaScript so that other people don't have to. So
On that note, last closing thoughts. Maybe I'll give mine, then you can give yours to finish up. The first Datastar conference we're going to have, I'm confident that we're going to have one. I think we talked about this idea of like, printing the entire library source code on a t-shirt, because it is that small. And I suggest everybody just, go look at the source code just to see, because to me, it's still unbelievable. Like, how can this tiny amount of code provide so much functionality and be so powerful? That's it for me, though. I really value the community as well and the people in there. Not because everybody's trying to be extremely helpful and polite. On the contrary, like, people are talking straight, and people are not afraid to admit their mistakes, and everybody's there learning something new. And or me, as the case is for me, like unlearning a lot of the old stuff and picking up better ways of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'm excited about too, because it's a self-selecting group right now, in that you're only really interested in Datastar is if other tools have burned you. Like, I don't think most people would just come in and go, oh, obviously this is the right way to do things. I think you have to get burned by other tools before you really see the value. And I will say that people will think that I have really strong things or I'm really inflexible. I mean, I earned this gray hair over many a project and like a long time. So like, I love to learn about new things. I love to be wrong and to be better. So I'm actively trying to be better in a lot of different ways. And already the community's helped me think of some really interesting ideas, orthogonal to Datastar, because I think Datastar is done, but there's ideas around, we'll talk about on other podcasts like Darkstar and some of the other things that I think that we can do that are separate tools, but they tie into the same mentality. So I will love to be proven wrong by anyone that comes on. Like, show me that I'm wrong, but like, be ready for a fight, because that's, I think, how you become a better engineer in general, is for someone to actually, not to say this is the way we're doing it because it's the way we're doing it, actually explain it out and say, hey, if you got a better idea, you have to think about the other consequences. So yeah, I think the community is already starting to be really solid, and keeping that same vibe going, I think really matters, because I think that's, Jonathan Blow a while ago did basically the downfall of software. And I don't always agree with him on most things, but occasionally, man, he comes up with some bangers. And I do think that part of it is that people have lost the desire to understand things at a deeper level, and to understand the consequences and the trade-offs of things. And they go off of what came out of a blog, but they haven't actually tested it themselves, and they don't do metrics-based development and all those kinds of things. So I do think that, if nothing else, I hope we foster the next group of people, really smart people, and that in some ways this becomes an extension of what Carson was already doing. Because I wouldn't be where I'm at with this stuff if Carson didn't get the ideas out there and go, hey, that's a really good idea. And I didn't agree with the implementation. Now I can't wait for someone to basically say, hey, I like Delaney's ideas, but man, his implementation could be so much better doing X. I can't wait for the day that someone outdoes Datastar. I'm super excited about that. So I think everything has a progression, and the shorter the half-life of Datastar, the better. Like, that's what I'm hoping for. So I look forward to having another podcast and talking to everybody like in the Discord. Yeah, join the Discord, be part of the community, yell at us. So
great. So I'll wrap up by saying thank you, Delaney, for taking those ideas even a step further and creating Datastar, putting it out there for free for everyone to use. Thanks for having me on the journey with you, and I look forward to many adventures to come.
Yeah, I wouldn't have it any other way. Well, see you guys soon.